Hey everyone, this is Chappie over here at Intense, and for today's video we're going to be going over how to set up sag on our Intense Tracer 279 and 29. Let's get started. Alright, so the two bikes that we have with us today to go over this process is the Tracer 29 Pro as well as the Tracer 279 Expert. So on the Tracer 29 Pro we're going to have a Fox Float X2 Air, and then on the front we're going to have a 38 Performance Elite fork, which this will have a grip 2 damper, which we do not need to alter. I always recommend to leave that in your preferred setting to set up sag, or at least at the base setting. Then on the Tracer 279 Expert, it's going to have a coil rear shock, so it's a little bit different process to set the sag up there, as well as a performance fork that does have a lockout lever. So we'll want to make sure that that lever is in the open position as we begin this process. Now for both rear shocks, we want to make sure the rear lockout is in the open position or in down position. Now for the grip 2, we want to make sure we leave the grip 2 damper in our preferred or recommended settings to set sag. For the rear shock, we want to make sure that the lockout lever is in the open position or in the down position. On the performance fork, we're going to have a grip damper, and we just need to make sure that this lockout lever is in the open position. All right, so now that we have the suspension prepped to begin this process, I always recommend to refer to the user manual for both of the bikes to give you a really good starting point for air pressures as well as spring rates for the coil shock. All right, so now that the bike is ready, now that we are ready, dressed and ready, let's go over the tools that we're going to need to set up the sag. The only tools that are required to set up sag are the included suspension pump as well as a measuring device. If your bike is equipped with a coil shock, a coil spring to match your spring rate recommended in the user manual will also be needed in order to complete this process. All right, so one of the things that we want to do is go ahead and take a look in our user manual. In the user manual, you will find the recommended pressures for both the fork and the shock for both of these models, and that'll give you a really good starting point. Once we set our pressures to those recommended settings, we will go through the sag setup as well as check process to make sure everything's dialed in and also tailor into personal preference. All right, so now that we've gone ahead and taken a look at the user manual, we know that the recommended setting for my body weight in this particular setting, please refer to your body weight in that, is going to be 80 psi. So what we'll do here is loosen and remove the air cap here on the rider's left-hand side of the fork. Once we remove that, we'll take our suspension pump that was included with our bike. The cap off, we're going to take our shock pump, line it up onto the threads of the Schrader valve here. Get those threads started. Once we get that lined up, tightened, we're going to take a look and see where we are on our gauge. So we are at about 90 psi. Now for my rider weight of 145 pounds, we need to drop this down to 80 psi. And then from there, we can move on to the rear shock and setting up the rest of the sag. From there, we'll remove the suspension pump from the fork. We'll go ahead and replace the cap so we don't lose track of it. Those threads started, get that threaded on. Just snug, we don't need to torque this down with any amount of pressure, just make sure it's snug. All right, with the fork set to the recommended pressures, we're going to move to the shock. So the Schrader valve on the shock is located on the rider's left-hand side. And now that we've looked at the user manual, we do know that our recommended pressure for my weight at 140 pounds is going to be anywhere from 160 to 170 psi. So let's go ahead and get those pressures adjusted and we'll move on from there. Remove the Schrader valve cap here. Hang on to it so it doesn't fall down, get lost, and then we'll hook up our suspension pump just by aligning and gently getting those threads started. Once we hear that noise, we know that the shock pump is connected. All right, so now that we have the shock pump connected, it looks like we are at about 150 psi. We need to bump this up from 160 to 170, so we'll bump this up to 165 pounds for good measure. All right, so there we're about 165 psi. Now what's important with the shock is we need to cycle this shock a couple times in order for it to equalize the pressure between the negative and the positive air chambers. So we're going to do that really quick and then just double check to make sure our pressures are still at 165, and then we can remove the pump. Coming back to the shock pump, looks like we are all good. No pressure loss there. So we can go ahead and unhook our shock pump. That hiss that you hear is just air leaving the hose and not leaving the shock itself, so nothing to be worried about there. Set the pump aside. We'll throw our cap on right now so we don't lose it. All right, so now switching over to the Tracer 279, the fork setup is exactly the same as far as air pressure charts, so we have no differences there, but when we go back to the back, and we have a coil shock, that process is a little bit different. This takes a little bit of planning and knowing what your rider weight is and looking at the user manual to determine your spring weight. And then also in that user manual, it'll show you what spring comes on the bike. For a size large, it does come spec'd with a 500-pound spring. For my rider weight, I need a 400-pound spring, so we're gonna go ahead and switch that spring out so we can continue on with our sag setup. Go ahead and remove the shock out of the front triangle here. All right. New spring on. That preload collar set. At this point we want to get to 0, which is the spring just to the point it's not moving, and then we want to go starting at about 1.5 turns. All right, and that'll be our minimum preload to set. All right, and then shock back in the bike. All right, so now that we have the suspension set up to the recommended settings, we're gonna see where they actually lie with our body weight, our positioning. It's also very important at this point to make sure whatever gear you typically ride and that you have it on. So whether you have a backpack or not, whatever, make sure that's on for this part of the process. So find yourself a steady cabinet or workbench, something you can kind of lean yourself against but not have too much weight onto. The main goal here is to make sure all your body weight is on the bike and nothing is on anything else around you. So once we're there, we're gonna basically just give the bike a couple neutral bounces, try to drive through the feet, and then from there, we're gonna slide that O-ring down till it meets the top edge of our seal on our fork. Okay. And on the shock, we're gonna do that same process. We're gonna grab that O-ring, slide it down to the seal. Once those are set, we can gently get off the bike, making sure that we do not compress the suspension anymore, and it's just simply a decompression. All right, so now that we have our O-ring set, we can go ahead and go over some measurements here. So what we're looking for is anywhere from 15 to 25% sag, and knowing that this is a 170 millimeter fork, at 20%, which is right in the meat of our scale there, is gonna be 34 millimeters. So we're gonna grab our ruler, the metric side, and we're gonna take a look and see where we sit. All right, so now that we have our ruler up here, we can see that actually, surprisingly, we were right on the money first try. So we were at 34 millimeters. This gives us at a 20% sag. Now, if you like a little bit firmer feeling front suspension, you can go down to 15. If you like something a little bit softer, you can go all the way up to 25%. So we're right where we want to be in the meat. All right, so next we're moving to the rear shock. So the rear shock on the Tracer 279 and 29 both have a 65 millimeter stroke, and what we're going to be shooting for here is 30% sag. So 30% of 65 is 19 millimeters. So the measurement we're looking for is 19 millimeters between the seal and the O-ring. So let's go down into the shock and take a look and see where we're at. All right, now that we got our ruler lined up, it looks like we are right on 19 millimeters. So that recommended pressure got us right where we needed to be. All right, so if you have a higher number than 19 millimeters or a lower number than 19 millimeters, all you need to do is just adjust the air pressure in the shock in order to compensate whether it's stiffer or softer in order to get to our target number of 19 millimeters. All right, so moving back over to the 279, our sag setup and check process is identical on the fork, so we're gonna be looking for that 34 millimeters to get us right at that 20% mark, which lies between 15 and 25. And in the rear, we're going to be looking for that same exact number of 19 millimeters, which is 30% sag, which is always recommended in order to get the suspension to perform as intended. Now with the coil shock, it is a little bit more difficult to access that measurement, and that's why we recommend so heavily to go off of your recommended spring rate. For me in this situation at 145 pounds, I needed a 400-pound spring. So we're going to check to see where we are at, and then we're going to show the easiest way to get that measurement. All right, so with a coil shock, in the lack of access here, the easiest way to get the sag number here is to basically push this bumper up. Now you can do it with a finger or any type of device. I'm using a pick here just to make it easier for our video. But we'll just slide this bumper up, and we want to slide it all the way up until it reaches the base of the shock or the seal of the shock. All right, so now that we've sat on the bike and gently got off, we can take a look and see where our bumper rests. And what we're measuring here is the distance between the shock body and the bottom out bumper that we pushed up to it. So it is tricky to get in here and get a clear measurement. So do your best to get the best view and alignment possible. Basically, what we're going to be looking for is 19 millimeters. All right, so now we know we are at 19 millimeters, so we're good to go here. However, if you see that your numbers are too low or too high, you can make small adjustments just with preload. And preload is going to be handled simply by rotating the preload collar, whether it's going to be clockwise or counterclockwise, to adjust that sag. With the bike unloaded, we can turn our preload collar in our spring like this in a clockwise direction. This is going to reduce our preload. Now we want to make sure that we don't go below 1.5 turns of preload from our base setting. If our number is too high in our sag, we need to stiffen our suspension. So we can do that simply by rotating the preload collar counterclockwise up to a maximum of 5 turns. Now if we have to go outside of that window of 1.5 turns or 5 turns, we either need to go to a lighter spring or a heavier spring depending on what side of the spectrum you're on. All right, so now we have our pressures set. So from this point, all we need to do to make sure everything is dialed in is make sure that our compression and rebound is set accordingly. Now you'll find inside the user manual for both bikes in multiple suspension platforms that the rebound and compression recommendations are in line with the air pressure values that you have set. So we'll take this opportunity to make sure we get those adjusted now, and then from that point we're ready to go hit the trails. All right, so on the Grip 2 damper, we have 2 dials here up on the top for compression. So the blue dial is your high-speed compression. So if we want our suspension to be stiffer on high-speed impacts and jumps and so on and so forth, we'll turn this in a clockwise direction. If we would like the suspension to be a little bit softer and sit a little bit lower in its travel during those high-speed impacts, we would want to turn in a counterclockwise direction. The black dial in the center is our low-speed compression. So a lot of this controls like body-induced movements, braking, things of that nature. If we want to soften things, we are going to want to turn in a counterclockwise direction, and same as the high-speed. If we want to stiffen the low-speed compression, we can turn in a clockwise direction. All right, and then the rebound on most every fork is going to be on the right side or the damper side. So with the Grip 2 damper, there is a high-speed and low-speed rebound, so refer to the chart there. You have your low-speed rebound, which is this knob here, which is the base knob, and then you have your high-speed, which sits a little bit further up, and you can see this stepped knurl there, and this will actually turn the whole dial. Real small clicks, they make a big difference, so definitely as you adjust, just make small, minute changes and then go test. And always remember to put that cap back on to keep those protected. All right, moving to the back of the bike, on the Float X2 Performance Shock, we have just low speed compression and rebound settings, and that's handled through a 3mm Allen through the center here. So we're engaging our low speed compression. Same as the fork, you turn in a clockwise direction, it firms things up, turn in a counterclockwise direction, and it softens things. With rebound, same thing, low speed rebound only adjustment here. You turn in a counterclockwise direction, softens things up, or in this case, speeds things up. You turn in a clockwise direction, and this will firm things up or slow things down. All right, so there you have it. We have successfully completed the sag setup process on our Tracer 29 and 279. If you need any assistance or need any help along the way, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to help you through each step of the process. Thanks so much for choosing Intense.